Hello and welcome everyone. On behalf of Observer Research Foundation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all for this very special session on strengthening India-EU cooperation, economy, society and multilateralism. This is part of our Portugal-India series of conversations that we at ORF have been hosting over the last few months in close collaboration with the Portuguese Embassy in New Delhi. And so this is part of a series of conversations, and this conversation today focuses on the three verticals that I mentioned earlier. In the past, we have hosted sessions on climate change, climate action, environmental policy, as well as on digital interactions between India and the EU. And in light of the recent India-EU summit, the three verticals, the three aspects of this engagement that we are talking about today, economy, societal changes, and the ability to to shape public policy, as well as the multilateral order and what India and the European Union can do together to shape that multilateral order. These three will be the focal points of the discussion today. And we have a great panel with us, both looking at the India side as well as the European Union side of the equation. So I welcome you all once again, and I hope this conversation is as productive as the India-EU summit a few weeks back was. With that, I welcome you all once again, all the panelists, and I hand it over to Mithali for taking this conversation forward. Mithali, over to you.
Harsh, thank you so much for that. And indeed, it is an extremely luminous panel we've got here today. It's interesting also that you made the point about how our previous conversations have focused on either green finance or some other aspect of cooperation. I don't think we've had such a broad and overarching theme and dialogue in the last couple of months. So it's really great to have all of you. As Harsh pointed out as well, this is coming off from the EU-India summit. And of course, it's coming off from a year and a half or more of this pandemic, where I think more and more it has become apparent to nations that partnerships are key, whether you're looking at the strategic side, the economic side, or health imperatives. So let me one by one introduce some of the topics that we're going to delve a bit deeper on, and introduce you all as well to our panelists today. A big welcome, of course, to those who've joined in as attendees. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you join in as well with questions. So let me start off right from the top. The first topic that we're going to be taking up is building resilience in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, whether it's growth or jobs or building more resilient healthcare systems. Joining in for that is Pedro Brinca, who's Assistant Professor at the Nova School of Business and Economics, Lisbon. Welcome to you. We're also talking, most importantly, I believe personally, about social transitions. What are we doing to ensure greater inclusivity, greater equality? And I think that should really be the bedrock for all nations in terms of a conversation going forward. So both my guests today are going to be addressing that. Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive at the Center for Policy and Research, and Tiago Fernandes, who's Associate Professor, Department of Political Science and Public Policy at the University Institute of Lisbon. And last but not the least, all this, of course, sits within the grid and structure of multilateralism and security cooperation. So that's what we're going to talk about, the EU and the Indo-Pacific, really, what are the models that we can work from here on. And joining in to talk about that are Mr. Gulshan Sachdeva, who's Professor and Chairperson, Center for European Studies at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Constantino Xavier, who is a Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. That's quite a mouthful in terms of the big panel we have. So let me also take 2 minutes to quickly walk you through what we see as the path of this conversation today. I thought I might open it up to all my panelists one by one for opening comments, just to put some form and structure to this conversation. And then, of course, we'll get more free-flowing with what we pick up in terms of threads and ideas and what comes out of it. So let me start off straight off with Pedro. Pedro, I'm inviting you to kick it off in terms of your opening thoughts.
Hi, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you. I mean, this talk follows more than 500 years of diplomatic relations between our countries. Portugal is an old country in Europe, but still young compared with the history of India, of course. And we're very proud that Portugal was actually the first Western country with a head of state of Indian origin. So our Prime Minister's António Costa's father, Orlando Costa, he grew up in Goa and stayed there until the age of 17. And António Costa himself, our Prime Minister, as an overseas citizenship of India card, right? So I think on top of all this history that binds us together, we also have some additional ties during these times. As I said, my name is Pedro. I'm an assistant professor at Nova School of Business and Economics. My specialty is macroeconomics. I study mostly things that relate to fiscal policy, changes in the impacts of technology in labor relations that stem to areas like taxation, inequality, and so forth. And when I think about India, and I was invited for this talk, the first thing that I thought is that Portugal does indeed have a structural problem in terms of an aging population. People in Portugal just stopped having kids, and even though there are, of course, many reasons for why is it so, whatever policies that we come up with to counteract that, because of course, if we have an aging population, the burden, between commas, of course, of the people who are retired and so forth for the welfare state becomes higher and higher, threatening the sustainability of this welfare state model. And we can think about policies to promote fertility and having people having more kids, but in the short to medium run, there's no technology to make kids, being born with 20-something years old, ready to go to the job market and, create value added, raise taxes, and so forth. So one of the key things, and it's the only way for us to go over this demographic crisis, is precisely through immigration. And when you think about India, India is more than a country, it's almost like a continent, right? The top 10 cities in India have more than 6 times the population of Portugal, with the 2 top cities, Mumbai and Delhi, alone by themselves, each one of them having more population than the whole of Portugal combined. And Portugal has made some headway in terms of memorandums of understanding between Portugal and India on different areas that go from defense, agriculture, marine research, IT, startups, a lot of areas where we've been having these conversations on how to foster these economic relations between the countries. But I think one key thing that can foster that also is precisely to have programs that could help people from India to come to Portugal. We really need you to come and create value and also import a lot of knowledge. Some of India's higher education institutions, especially in technology, are among the top in the world. And for sure, we could benefit a great deal from having more people from India coming to Portugal. And of course, since we have a big Indian community also in our country, we can also provide very good environment for receiving them, integrating them, and making them feel that they are part of the country.
Pedro, thank you so much for that. I feel like it's a great segue to go to Yamini now for her opening comments, because everything of what Pedro said, Yamini, is everything of what India and India's youth probably need at this point: opportunity and access.
Thank you, Mithali, and thank you, ORF, for organizing this really important conversation. I think India-EU relations have always been thought of somehow as these 2 blocks, the India as a country and EU, and yet there are also very deep bilateral relationships that we have with different countries, owing to the dynamics owing to our history, our polity, and even present immigration patterns. So it's very important for us to always remember in these conversations that we have to think of this as a combination of bilateral and a multilateral engagement, which often falls off the table when you think of relationships in the forms of big blocs. So this is a wonderful opportunity to look at the intersections between bilateral relations and multilateralism as we go forward. I think in response to the issues that Pedro pointed out, India is in so many ways diametrically opposite to the challenge of Portugal, as he described. Portugal is dealing with the challenge of an aging society, and we are dealing with what could have been an opportunity of a unique demographic dividend, which for the moment for India is looking still an opportunity, but one that could translate into a ticking time bomb if we aren't able to respond appropriately to the demands of what it would take for us to convert a young population, which is the current demography that we have, into an opportunity for it to become a demographic dividend. And we face, I think, three very crucial challenges, and in many ways, COVID has highlighted these more sharply than ever before. One is the challenge of building a strong welfare state while at the same time dealing with demands of growth. And in India, we've often framed this as sometimes as a trade-off between economic growth versus welfare, that you look at how the European welfare state emerged. It emerged from the foundations of industrialization and an emerging formal economy, whereas in India, we are dealing with large amounts of informality and a growth that was looking rosy until a few years ago and now looking far more complex. And I think that we did in India in the early 2000s make some strides towards laying foundations of what could be a robust welfare state, but there is a lot that we can learn about transitions, opportunities, moments, and structures of building welfare states that are complementary and supporting of growth, rather than as being framed, as it often does in the Indian context, as binaries and trade-offs that one has to live with. So I think that's one of the very important arenas where learning for India can happen, and an opportunity also for people-to-people exchange to build on our own knowledge bases and learn from what countries such as yours have done. At the same time, I think there are also very important opportunities that we can build on in arenas of healthcare. COVID has highlighted more starkly than ever before how globally interconnected health is, in fact, even as countries are individually struggling with challenges of health infrastructure. Ultimately, public health is global health, and that means that we need to be working closely with each other. The last 2 months have perhaps been an important reminder for India as well, that we are equally dependent on global institutions for supporting and helping us in times of crisis, as we are on the strengths and weaknesses of our own institutions. So again, possibilities for strengthening partnerships as well as technology transfers in health could be the foundations of a new imagination of partnerships and relationship building. Last but not the least, of course, on climate. I know you've had detailed conversations on climate in the past, but we can't think of a post-COVID growth narrative without bringing in the challenges of sustainability and climate change into what it means for us to build a sustainable economy on the back of the challenges that we confront today. And I think here there's a need for India and Europe to be able to bridge a dialogue a little bit more closely. We've had a very robust conversation in India about net zero targets and what does and does not make sense for India, given the realities of our own growth trajectories, given the framework of common but differentiated responsibilities. What is the best way for India to address the push for coming up with an ambitious net zero target versus doing something that sensibly is more realistic and will actually help us achieve goals. And again, here, I think there's a lot that India is learning, and where deeper partnerships and sharing can come into play. A lot has probably been talked about on the fiscal side, on issues of technology, but I think one issue that we don't discuss enough, which I just wanted to bring up here, is that of learning about what it takes to build climate institutions of governance. And here, I think there's a lot to learn from how different countries are trying to build their governance institutions, because addressing the problem of climate is not a siloed issue. It requires diplomacy, it requires thinking about urbanization, it requires thinking about agriculture, it requires thinking about industrialization all together. And that requires a very different kind of institutional framework than one that bureaucracies of the 20th century, which are currently dealing with 21st century challenges, are able to manage. So I think different countries are learning and experimenting in different ways. And again, there's unique opportunity of sharing. And lastly, since Pedro was talking about his interest in his work on fiscal policy, I think again a lot of our 20th century understandings or early 21st century understandings of macro fiscal policy are also being challenged in the times of COVID. We need to rethink, build new frameworks, and it needs a collective dialogue because our economies are, of course, interconnected and interlinked. And as each country is dealing with the crisis that COVID has presented itself with for its economies, a collective dialogue on reimagining macrofiscal in the context of post-COVID economies, I think is going to be important going forward. So another collective conversation that we could be having. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yamini. All points well taken. And I think you're absolutely right on climate. Unfortunately enough, at this point, we don't even have a common airshed framework for Northern India. So I think governance is really up there, along with everything else, including finance. Tiago, let me turn to you for your opening comments now.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation to the Observer Foundation, to the Portuguese Embassy in India, and to the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it's my pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. This invitation, actually, I took it as a very interesting challenge to, try to compare two regions of the world, or to look at two regions of the world which are usually not compared, or very unfrequently compared, and to see how can we learn with the theoretical and empirical comparison and the reflection on how these two political blocs face contemporary challenges regarding democratization, inclusion, social equality, and the compatibility between economic development and social justice. And one of the things that actually, after doing some thinking, came to my mind is that the parallels between India and the European Union are closer than one would thought. For one thing, they both are part of the birth of the second wave of democratization after World War II. Both European Union and both India become independent and they start their full their full path towards institutionalization and creation of some form of state autonomy and independence in the case of India after World War II. And they both share some other commonalities. First, they are units that see democracy as their main driving principle and organizing principle, and they have a founding ideology of inclusion. And that's very interesting in the case of in the case of India. Some scholars have called it, the first founding ideologies of the Congress Party with Gandhi and others, some form of inclusive nationalism as opposed to exclusionary nationalism. The same could be found in Europe. Europe, the founding of the European Union and the European integration process in the early 50s. It's part of actually previous traditions that go back to the Enlightenment, but you go back to theoretical level to Kant and other thinkers, but also at the more political and institutional level, the European Union is a way to resolve ultranationalism and the rivalry that destroyed Europe between World War I and World War II, and with World War I and World War II. And so these are parallels that are quite interesting, and that put somehow the European Union and India in the same path. Obviously, these two units have evolved also in different ways, but they also in today's world they face similar problems. One problem has already been alluded by the previous presenters, by my colleagues here, is how to make compatible the demands of economic growth and social justice and equality and inclusion. Yamini has mentioned that, and that has been, obvious during the Great Recession in Europe, in particular the impact that the Great Recession had in Southern Europe, where all social service was somehow eroded in favor of an ideology of the market that created huge inequalities and poverty and had huge negative consequences for social welfare, especially in the more peripheral regions of Europe, like Portugal, Spain, Greece, but also affecting countries severely like Italy and France. The second aspect that both units, both India and the EU, the second challenge that both India and the EU face is the rise of ultranationalism and xenophobic populism. I mean, you see that at the level of national government in India, but you also see, and that's part of a global wave of democratic backsliding that also affects Europe in places like Hungary and in places like Poland, and also the rise of isolationism, the recent example of Brexit in the EU, and you see those same challenges in India as well. So how to cope with these challenges, which ultimately have an undemocratic basis, and which would erode the earlier founding ideologies and aims of making a society more democratic, more inclusionary in terms of welfare rights and also in terms of civic and other rights, and respect for minorities, respect for religious tolerance, respect for pluralism, ethnic, cultural, religious pluralism, social pluralism, and so on. So these are challenges that India and Europe both face, and they have a lot to learn from one another in that regard. Second aspect that I would like to mention, so with this common background, I would mention two other things that I think are important, that to deepen democracy and deepen social inclusion and social conditions, the social inclusion and equality. One is, I do think that the main drivers for social inclusion and for equality are internal to the states, and depend on the capacity that political forces working together with civil society have in order to empower popular groups that make demands on the state and somehow are able to constrain policies in order to develop, to constrain politicians that as a consequence are constrained to develop policies which are egalitarian to the majority of the population and to popular groups in general. I mean, here I would draw on research I did on Southern Europe. One has to have, so looking at when I published a series of books and articles on how did the 5 Southern European countries, which includes France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, from the mid 60s to the present, have been able to create inclusive welfare states and the rule of law and respect and inclusion of minorities or groups which are not usually part of the national community, like immigrants, or extend the rights of political participation and inclusion to women as well. And that has much dependent on the ability of of these countries to forge what I call a progressive coalition, a coalition for equality and inclusion. And that coalition is composed of a series. I mean, I can talk a bit later with more detail about that, but it's composed of different groups of civil society, where unions are important, but also social movements, citizens movements of different sorts, women's movements, immigrants movements, and together with center, with left-wing parties, to radical left parties, they're able to form temporary coalitions for social progress and for social inclusion. And that has been quite evident in the case of France and in the case of Portugal as well, a bit less so in Spain, and this has been almost non-existent in Greece and in Italy. So why these coalitions come up, and why are they succeed in some places and not in others? And I think those lessons could be important for India, but also Indian lessons are very important also for Europe. So for instance, I mean, obviously you know this much better than I mean, I'm very ignorant about India, but places in India like West Bengal and especially the state of Kerala have been able to build models of, as far as I know from the literature, models of social inclusion and social equality that have put those regions of India at par with and even surpassing some comparable countries in the world, comparable regions of the world, which are, you know, some more which has a long tradition of inequality and exclusion and poverty and caste, somehow caste-like forms of social difference. And these difficulties have been eroded and been able to surpass in the case of those regions. So that's something that we in Europe should be able to learn. The second aspect that I do think that it's important to consolidate inclusion and democracy. It's obviously, and my colleagues know about this much better than I, Constantino and Gulshan, but I would also mention the international dimension. Now, this is also a very, the international dimension is crucial also to consolidate democracy and inclusion in, democratic polities. First of all, as I mentioned a while ago, we live in an age of eventually global recession of democracy, with the rise of regional powers which may want to try, at least one of them, try to build an alternative social order in the world, you know, authoritarian, kleptocratic capitalism in China. And that puts, I mean, and there are other dangers as well in the international field, but that puts a challenge to countries like India and to regions like Europe. How it creates opportunities as well. I mean, these countries provide the sheer economic power and military and growing military power of China creates this challenge and opportunities also for countries to drive away from the traditional multilateral and liberal international order that's been dominated by the US in the past. So how do these countries react to this threat, that also challenge, with a new role that with the Biden presidency, one can see in the horizon that President Biden is trying to build a community of democracies, so it seems. So what are the role that Europe and India have in this new configuration at the international level, and that will be decisive also to the future of inclusion, solidarity, and democracy. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, and that's a sobering description indeed. Global recession of democracies, something to think about for a long while. Mr. Sachdeva, let me turn to you, sir, because all this sort of juxtaposes into what happens with strategic cooperation. Who chooses to partner with whom and for whom? Let me ask you for your opening comments.
Thank you, Mitali, and thank you, ORF and Portuguese Embassy for the invitation and opportunity. Now, as the pandemic is still unfolding, I think its full implications are difficult to predict. However, I think it's quite clear that post-pandemic world is likely to be significantly different world altogether. Now, the shape of post-COVID EU and India, I think, will depend on the handling of the health crisis and also related economic difficulties. Now, the world order was already in transition, but I think the pandemic has accelerated this change. Now, the Western world, under the leadership of the US, is now trying to regain its leadership role under President Biden. Now, China is expanding and asserting. However, suspicions about China are also growing. Now, the multilateral institutions, including the WTO and WHO, are much less effective. Both EU and India believe in a democratic and multipolar world. And I think would also like to promote effective multilateralism. They can build large coalitions, as both of them are not seen as threatening powers by most countries in the world. Now, the core of India-EU relations have been economics. The EU's main competencies are also in the areas of trade and investment. And I'm glad that after EU-India Leaders Summit, now the resumption of FTA negotiations and investment agreements are back on agenda. And to a large extent, I think the evolving geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific has been responsible for bringing main economic issues on top of the agenda. When there were limited conversations of trade and investment issues, both India and EU, they moved to many other areas, including security. On defense and security matters, I think traditionally India used to work mainly with individual member states. It developed a good framework of security and defense cooperation with major European powers. And these were covered under bilateral strategic partnerships, particularly with France, Germany, and earlier also with the UK. And, many decades, India was also working very closely on defense-related matters with some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. With the EU, I think now India has established a couple of security-related dialogues. And the last few years, I think the maritime security has become an important area of cooperation. Now, as the European understanding on the Indo-Pacific is evolving, some member states like France, Germany, Netherlands have come up with their own approaches, and the EU itself has published its own conclusions on the Indo-Pacific. Now, these documents and the related discussions, I think they points towards a couple of things. One, the focus on Indo-Pacific would be increasing. The EU's economic presence is already quite significant in the region. The geopolitical competition is becoming intense. And in all these approaches, I think the centrality of ASEAN is also emphasized. So the EU would like to advance its economic interest to protect its value chains. And if you look at the EU document, the China is mentioned only in the context of investment agreement, and India is mentioned in the context of deepening economic ties. And of course, there are indirect inferences in the context of connectivity, security, cooperation, etc. But the sense you get from different European approaches is that Europe would like to protect its economic interests in this dynamic area. But still, I think its approach towards China is ambivalent. Of course, India also talks about inclusive Indo-Pacific. But in most conversations on Indo-Pacific and Quad, the idea is to build some kind of collective platform against assertive China. But European understanding so far, if I'm able to read it correctly, is slightly different. Although EU is worried about assertive China, but it doesn't want to be part of any geopolitical competition in this region. So it is sincerely favors inclusive Indo-Pacific, in which China is also not excluded from the narrative. So as the concept of Indo-Pacific is evolving, I think we do need more and more conversations on the issue with Europe. So then we can actually, maybe come out with some kind of, common understanding. Otherwise, there is also a danger of confusing this concept further. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Constantino, you are now shouldered with the task of circling everything that you've heard and putting it into your comments as well before we dive into questions and answers.
Thank you, Mitali, and thanks to the Observer Research Foundation and to the Embassy of Portugal in Delhi for really bringing us all together. And it's now towards the end of the Portuguese presidency of the Council. I think we're coming to the end, but it's been, I'd say, a truly exceptional and extraordinary 6 months of what Lisbon and Delhi have been achieving, not only culminating in the Porto Summit, which we saw, but in many other channels of engagement that have started and pushed forward a series of engagements between the European Union and India. And that, I think, to my mind, I've been looking at the EU-India relationship for a long time, had last happened 15 to 20 years ago. There was a lull, a slowdown between the EU and India for many reasons, and I think we're back now to a very promising potential still relationship. Let's see what the future brings. I want to focus just on multilateralism because I think you chose this topic not by coincidence. It is really a structuring concept in the EU-India relationship. It is a cardinal principle in both the approaches of the European Union and India, and I'd say Portugal too. So I'll use Portugal and European Union in a slight interchangeable way in my next 3-4 minutes. But I think it is a very important concept. It is making a comeback, and it's actually making a comeback also as it had done in the early 2000s when you look at the EU-India discussions and statements then. But it's making a comeback now in a context of change, transition, crisis, if you want to call it, of multilateralism. And that makes it all the more incumbent and imperative and interesting for the European Union and India to take a leading role in trying to, what we say often, reinvent multilateralism, global governance, international institutions, etc. And I'll try to explain that with a concept from political science. Tiago and Yamini will look at it from one angle, I look at it from the other one, and it's often not liked in India, but in many ways, international institutions and multilateralism are the weapon or the weapons of the weak. The weapons of those that are not as powerful, that don't have as much interest in just using power cynically and instrumentally. It is generally the instrument or the avenue that is favored by middle and small powers in the world system. There's a particular interest in Portugal, obviously. Let's call Portugal a small country with Lisbon's permission, and maybe a semi-peripheric country with Tiago's permission in terms of the political economy today. I would risk it is on that semi-periphery, or it'll become more and more of a semi-periphery in some ways. But I think at the same time also for India. India is realizing that the asymmetry with China has been growing dramatically. It will continue to grow in most indicators. And therefore, you start looking at the value that institutions bring to your strategy and foreign policy because they reduce transaction costs, they allow you to exchange information, they allow you to build case-based coalitions, sort of, if I may use again a trade union metaphor, right? You're actually sharing and having a collective action towards the big powers in the system. So very briefly, looking just at what I've been looking at, the statements of both foreign ministers from Portugal and India over the last few years. Mr. Augusto Santos Silva, who's the foreign minister of Portugal, and Dr. S. Jaishankar, Professor Augusto Santos Silva, and Dr. S. Jaishankar, who's the external affairs minister of India, and how they looked at multilateralism. I find 5 very interesting points of convergence with slight divergence here and there. The number one, I think, point on multilateralism is that both India and Portugal, and the European Union in that sense, to recognize that we are in a profound transition between 2 different world orders. The old world order, which for 20 to 30 years we used to call the unipolar US-led order, is being dismantled, is slowing down, is fragmenting, and you have a second actor in the People's Republic of China that has been not only more powerful, but also more willing to use its capabilities to shape any issue in the world system. So that, I think, no one is under the illusion. I think both Lisbon and Delhi are very clear about recognizing and making a realist analysis of the world. In fact, sometimes more than I would say in Brussels, where there is a certain reluctance still to engage with this new order. Number 2, the topics of world governance have changed fundamentally. And in fact, climate action, which has been at the focus of international institutions and the attempt to reinvent multilateralism, is actually an old topic. It starts in the 1990s, the whole climate change through international institutions. Today, we're talking about data and the basic contract between the citizen and the state. We talk about artificial intelligence and the need to regulate basically machines. So these are the issues for which there's a huge vacuum still, a huge gap. And again, I see here, both if you look at the foreign policies of Lisbon and Delhi and the European Union showing up in leading roles in trying to regulate and find new vehicles of institutionalizing these discussions about these new topics. Third, norms. I think there is a substantive qualitative difference in the way Portugal and the European Union, again used interchangeably here, and India look at international institutions. And that reflects their domestic experience. That reflects their democratic quality. And I think in that sense, you see, for example, and I've made this argument many times in the last few years, and you will have to hear it again today, that on issues like data governance, India and Portugal and the European Union have a natural similar approach. They have representative parliaments, they have the rule of law, they have independent courts, more or less. We can all criticize, and we all have our ghosts in our respective closets, and we're all insufficient democracies. That's a tautology. I think that's a constant democratic deficit in any democracy. But certainly, if you go to Brussels, to Berlin, to Paris, to Lisbon, to Delhi, to Bombay, to Bangalore, to the sub-state level, even in India, the actors in that system recognize or operate, forget recognize, operate within a system that recognizes that democratic norms are the way they have to behave. Forget they want to behave. That is the current system that constrains them. So there's an alignment there too, in terms of reinventing multilateralism from a normative perspective, including, for example, on the sustainable development goals. I think SDG Article 16 has a very interesting concept about, I think, transparent institutions that cannot be openly democratic. The word democracy is not there, but transparency, accountability certainly speaks to, I think, European and Indian preferences. Fourth, leadership. I think there is a crisis of leadership today in multilateralism. We've now had 3 presidents of the United States of America that have put the emphasis on building the US at home. I won't call it isolationism, because President Biden also is not an isolationist. President Trump was also actually not an isolationist in many ways, nor was President Obama. But since 2009, we've now had 12 years of the US electing presidents and putting more emphasis on domestic issues and being not as activists, let's put it like that, in international institutions. And you can push this into a more cynic argument saying the US has never been actually a champion of international institutions, which I'm happy to buy in some ways too, but certainly it's been less than ever over the last few years. And I think the European Union and India have clearly taken interest in leading international institutions and reinventing it, finding new topics, and pushing multilateralism forward. If you look at the Alliance on Multilateralism, which is a Franco-German initiative, India is an enthusiastic participant of that. So enthusiastic that even Berlin and Paris were surprised to suddenly see India championing multilateralism and joining a Franco-German initiative. So I see there India much more engaged, and Portugal for sure. I mean, Portugal has an extraordinary capacity and experience in international institutions, whether in being a member of the United Nations Security Council, most recently in 2012, but also currently, for example, as an elected member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. I think, in fact, no other Western country was ever elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council with such a majority as Portugal was. So that normative alignment is clear. Sorry, on leadership, that I think that's clear that there is an interest and a willingness to reinvent multilateralism. Fifth and last is organization. I mean, how should multilateralism be organized? And here, there's a big split, I think, in the international community. There are the orthodox visions sticking to what's classically seen as a formal multilateralism, formal rules, conventions, secretariats, intergovernmental tracks. And I see India in particular, here I'm not sure about Portugal, much more inclined in terms of flexilateralism, minilateralism, microlateralism. We have many names for it, but this sort of flexible approach of let's just do it with whoever, however, quickly. A much more sort of tactical approach. And there I see a lot of work to be done still between the European Union and India. I think the European Union in that sense is much more focused on formal, classic multilateralism. And I see India much more agnostic about that and saying, you know what, we need to just build short, quick, tactical coalitions on sectoral issues, whether it's climate, whether it's technology, artificial intelligence. We'll just work on whatever is there in a quick, efficient way. So I'll end at that, Mitali, and pass the word back to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I can see a whole bunch of questions building up from the audience as well. So I'm going to squeeze in a couple of mine before I take them on. Pedro, I'd like to turn back to you and just go back to the initial point you made about how there's centuries and centuries of deep roots between these two parties that we're talking about, India and the EU. And yet perhaps the most prickly part of that is the lack of a trade agreement seeing the light. That's one conversation that's been on again, off again. We're talking again about the BPIA, something that went into the freezer in 2013. Does this look like a time that's right for that conversation to happen, especially considering how economies are emerging out of COVID?
I mean, there have been like a re-envision of trade in the last couple of years, especially due to COVID and the disruption of global value chains. And one of the pillars of the resilience plan and the next gen program at the EU level is precisely to reindustrialize Europe, right? And bring a lot of offshoring back to Europe. I'm a bit skeptical about that movement and those thoughts, precisely because there's a reason why, all this production was offshore to places like Southeast Asia. It's because it's cheaper. And all the prophets of doom saying that, trade would collapse and local would be the new black, if you want, kind of failed. I mean, trade levels now are at higher levels than they were before. I mean, Portugal by itself cannot do much in terms of trade agreements specifically. We're part of the EU. I mean, we can do that as member of the EU. And of course, as members of the World Trade Organization, all the kind of trade agreements that we do would include a set of rules and procedures that could be and necessarily be extended to other partners for the equal clause or equal access clause from the World Trade Organization. This being said, of course, I mean, the special moment for all the reasons that were debated here already on the relations between Portugal and India, especially now that Portugal holds the presidency of the EU, could be a key factor in fostering those historical relations, and could be instrumental to that point. There's been some talks, right? I mean, I know on the agricultural level, for example, I don't know much about the specificities of these agreements, but there were efforts on our side to get to some of the lychees production in India, and I guess we're trying to export also some specific products like pears and others. But of course, I mean, given the current institutional framework, I would say that now better than ever would be the time to foster those intentions. I would like just to comment on something that was brought up also before that had to do with the social inclusion and the political sustainability of these growth models. I mean, one thing that we've seen, and it was mentioned before by my panel colleagues, had to do with the disruptive effects of technology, like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so forth. I mean, the disruptive impact of technology on labor relations is not something that is especially new. I mean, in the 18th century, one of the contributors for major innovations on the automation of the production of cloth in England had to escape his own town because, one of the inventions that he made was very disruptive. It eliminated the need of a lot of manual work, and workers joined together and raided his house and broke his house, and he had to run away from the city because of popular unrest. The key different thing here relies on two pillars. One, this historical advance of technology and the ability that it empowers people to produce more with the same resources kept going since the 70s, but due to different reasons, offshoring was one of them, and this is the phenomenon especially in the West. What led to was to a detach between the increases in productivity stemming from technology development and average returns to hours worked. Something that has been kept closely aligned since the Industrial Revolution was completely disrupted in the 70s. And what we see, more especially, is growing inequalities, right? I mean, inequality as a whole in the world has decreased. The ratio of British or US GDP to India GDP or China GDP has been shrinking since the 60s and the 70s. So inequality in the global world as a whole has decreased, but not within societies, especially in the West, right? And as you know, as other emerging economies catch up, they will also kind of experience these disruptions. So that's one thing. The nature of technology that has been historically contributing to make everyone better off seems very biased these days, and is contributing to deepen inequalities within countries. And so that's a key factor. And the second thing is what it gives it origin to, which is the nature of technology. So since the 70s, what we saw also was that the relative price of goods that are used in the production process, technology goods, information, communications, transportation, they've been dropping a lot. The amount of rice or pears that you have to give in exchange for a computer 30 years ago or 40 years ago was much higher than what you have to do today to buy a technology that is 1,000 times better. This, of course, disrupts society, especially because the speed at which is being done is historically different. We have people who joined the labor markets in the 80s that today are in the late 50s and they are obsolete. And it's not just one or two. I mean, in the case of Portugal, for example, we are the second country in Europe with the highest share of population with the ninth grade or less. This means that a lot of people that employ, manual tasks in the north, where we have the cloth industries and so forth, all of a sudden have been substituted either by machines or their jobs have been offshore to Southeast Asia, right, and other destinations. And these kind of processes, they are politically disruptive. And I think the biggest challenge for our generation is how to take the most advantage of these improvements in technology, these labor-saving technologies, but at the same time, not leaving anyone behind. Not because we're nice people and it's the right thing to do, but even from a pragmatic standpoint, if 51% of the population is, excluded and is marginalized and has been left behind by this incredibly increasing speed of technology, revolution is bound to happen. Populism has been growing incredibly strongly in the last 30 years. The number of populist governments has been increasing like crazy. And one of the reasons is this, because many people feel left behind. So they feel the system has failed them. And as they feel that the system has failed them, anyone who's against the system, despite the message, and some people don't really kind of care much about the political content of some of these political initiatives, as they care about the style of going against the establishment. We saw that in the U.S. I guess we saw that in other countries. Portugal is having a little bit of a emergence of such political forces too. So I would say that's the biggest challenge for our generation. Make sure that we remain competitive, efficient, organized. We kind of garner the discipline that international trade and competitiveness brings for us to be productive and efficient and increase our living standards, but at the same time create networks of support that make sure that we don't have significant parts of the population being left behind and
Sure.
feed the rank of anti-establishment movements that by construction, if get to power, will change the establishment.
Sure. Mr. Sachdeva, let me ask you to respond to one of the points that Constantino made about how India chooses to build its alliances, and it's more tactical and short-lived in nature, in terms of whether you agree with that. And just to layer that question, whether you believe that for the combinations like the EU, they are now constantly, if not hyphenating, but constantly making a comparative choice between India and China.
Well, I mean, India's, of course, foreign policy is changing. And I think Tino has made very important points. And our understanding about the way we engage with the world is also changing, and that's rightly so, because when the world is changing, you need to change your the way, and that's fact. Now, the way how do we build these kind of ties between India and the European Union, particularly whether it's on the lateralism and other issues. The one is at the conceptual level, that one can discuss couple of things. At the same time, one also need to look at how both EU and India actually deal when the issues come, to global governance and multilateral institutions. Look at trade. Now, yes, everybody wants to work through global trade rules. At the same time, you look at the European Union, large amount of trade happens within the European Union, more than 60%. Then the European Union has also signed all the trade agreements, or trying to have signed agree. So it means, in fact, India was much more into the multilateralism. In that sense, India believed much more in WTO till the time everybody else start building all these regional trading blocks. So in that sense, one has to be conceptually clear that what really we want to achieve. At the same time, there are certain tacticals, which I think Tino has also mentioned. Now, when you are not able to achieve the broader goals, then of course you go for certain tactical, sectoral and other kind of issues. Now, the comparison between India and China, which European Union is making or anybody else is making, is to some extent is valid, because one thing is quite clear, that Asia is going to be a very important area of action, both geopolitically and also economically. And that has been the case for the last, I think, 10, 15 years. And now things are becoming even more clear. Now, within Asia, of course, if one looks at it, China, of course, is a very important player. It has already established itself as a major economic power, major diplomatic power, and also major military power. Now, along with China, which other countries one can look into? I mean, obviously, you country like Japan, a major economy, at the same time also India. Now, EU has a major issue, major problem here, because for many years, for EU, I think Asia remained to some extent China, because both are economic heavyweights. They engage economically in a very big way. And so obviously, both of them also looked at each other as huge economic opportunities. And this is what has happened, because if you look at the trade and services trade, which is about close to $600 billion every year, which is almost like 200 billion goods and services are being traded every day between China and the US, China and the European Union. Now, at the same time, now what is happening is that when China is expanding and asserting, there are certain worries within European Union and the member states. How do you really deal with this? They may not look at immediately as a security threat from China, as perhaps we can look at and some other countries in Asia would look at, but definitely they are within all the documents, if you can see from the European Union, they look at the systemic rival, they look at technological competitor, now, but at the same time, now the major, I think the worry for what EU is that now when the geopolitical competition is really increasing in Asia, and particularly between the US and China, they do not want to be really part of that competition. So that's what exactly I was trying to, when we're looking at the Indo-Pacific concept. If you look at all those, narratives which are coming from the EU, yes, they are worried about China, but at the same time, how do you really deal with, the recent, investment agreement, case in point, that, when things come to that, yes, this also to some extent showed them strategic autonomy to EU, that yes, we are not really looking at whatever the US is telling us to do that, even if this transatlantic alliance is very very solid. And now, obviously, there is a comparison, because there are certain values which European Union share, whether it's democracy and many other issues on socio-cultural and multiculturalism, etc. Which of course there are certain issues, but these are the values which perhaps European Union shares with India. At the same time, there are certain huge economic interests European Union has in China, so they would like to play a very important role. And this is what in fact sometimes worries me, because we should not depend too much on the European Union to kind of, look at China, in the sense that, yes, they'll be useful. At the same time, there are certain limits to what extent perhaps the European Union can go with India, concerning China itself. So one has to be very, very careful. And I can understand from the European point of view also, I mean, they would see economic opportunities in India, in other parts of Asia, and also in the entire Indo-Pacific, which is an area of, but the major problem in the Asia is that although Asia is going to be very dynamic, and the whole Indo-Pacific region is also going to be very dynamic in the years to come, but still, I think the security and economic architectures in this part of the world are still evolving. So where China fits into this, and where China, of course, would like to dominate this whole economic architecture as well as the security architecture, what is happening here, but what kind of role India is going to play here. Now, India perhaps, I would say India made a mistake not going with the RCEP, because now one clear-cut way in which the Asian economic architecture is going to be, and I think one of the building blocks of that is going to be RCEP, because within that you have ASEAN, you have all the major other economies in Asia, and somehow if India is not part of that, there is a bit of a worry that you are missing that point. But of course, without that, how can you build this? So there is a certain amount of those kind of problems which both India and China are facing, and similarly the problem also will come from the EU side, how you deal with these two major powers, which major interests are there. So they will continue to have these kind of issues, and that's why, in fact, when they talk about inclusive Indo-Pacific in most of their documents of the EU, and I think they do believe in those, sincerely in those, kind of inclusive, like, even if, I mean, India also would say inclusive Indo-Pacific, but, we are quite clear that, within this, we are trying to build certain kind of platform, which is kind of, which can counter assertive China, which that may not be exactly the kind of understanding perhaps the European Union will have. So those are the issues. Just one more point, Mitali. I mean, you have gone some, particularly on this FTA, or the point in the last you raised about. Now, this time, I think, of course, we have been there. This whole thing has been going on since 2007, and then the negotiations were frozen in 2013. Now, when we have started to kind of resumption of negotiations again, still it will take some time when we are going to have negotiation, perhaps maybe by the next summit or so. But I think there are certain lessons also we have learned in the past, because yes, certain technical issues which bureaucrats from both sides are going to negotiate. I mean, there are certain issues, one can get into all those details, where certain differences were there, where things have moved on, now things have changed now from where we left it in 2013. But I think one thing is quite clear, that if we really want to be successful in the India-EU FTA negotiations in the years time, in the next couple of years, what we really need to be much more transparent, and we really need to involve more political parties and also civil society groups within India. Because this was, I think, the mistake was done earlier. Because what happens is, even if you are somehow closer to signing the deal, and suddenly if there are certain tensions from different civil society groups, certain business groups, and other, then at the last minute, perhaps it becomes very difficult for political leadership to take those decisions. So now we have certain time till the time negotiations are done, and there we are going to conclude. Of course, within the European Union, they do have certain processes in which civil society is being kind of consulted. But in India, I think we need much more to perhaps, to get the, because for India, perhaps India is also looking, I'm slightly more, I would say, hopeful this time, because India is also looking some kind of breakthrough. Because, in the last 6-7 years, India hasn't signed any major trade deal with any important country. At the same time, our tariff rates have gone up. So we moved out from the RCEP at the last minute. Even the India-US trade deal has been, what are the limited trade deal has been elusive. So we, at the same time, the whole idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat has also created certain kind of confusing signals. So it means India would like to show to the world that yes, India is still open for business. We are still liberalizing our economy, and I think European Union, and also I think to some extent, the agreement with the EU, this will be the kind of test case which we are able to do that. Perhaps then we are moving into the new direction.
Yeah. There's actually a whole slew of questions that have built up from the audience. So I'm going to launch into those and then we'll see if there's time for me to ask. There's one question that's coming from Ashok Hansraj saying, what are the supports and incentives for EU companies to settle industry or activity in India to compete with mass production? And I think that's a fairly basic block. I mean, what are we doing with investment facilitation and protection for those interested in coming in?
I'm sorry, but your voice broke briefly. Could you just, sorry, I caught only the end of the question.
Let me repeat that. There's a question asking, what are the supports and incentives for EU companies to settle industry activity in India, particularly given, the competition we face from China? And that seems like a fairly basic building block to be, working on at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it actually gets to the heart of the policy challenge that India needs to confront and be much, much more realistic about. The combination of mixed policy signals that we have been sending, and I think I agree with what Kulshanji said just before. At this point in time, the Atmanirbharta sort of framing is giving mixed signals, despite the fact that India needs to be attracting investment. And even though after the lockdown last year, many state governments sort of did a relaxation of labor laws on the argument that this will help us attract more investment and get around. Since China is no longer the destination of choice that we could actually gain from this, we are sending. So it's sort of on the one hand, there was some attempt, and I put it in quotes because I don't think that was the right thing to do necessarily, but there was some attempt to signal that we were becoming more investor friendly and ease of business. And on the other, there's a broader policy framing, and with consistent increases in import tariffs, certainly signaling that we are actually looking much more inward than outward. So I think there is a very it's not just about EU, but more broadly for India to, if we want an export-oriented growth, which I think is the pathway at this point, then India needs to have a much, much more clear policy signaling and articulation. It also needs to put its money where its mouth is on issues around ease of doing business and creating a more transparent and accessible process of attracting investments. So red tape, paper, bureaucratic processes that tend to become hurdles need to be cleaned up. We talk about ease of business a lot. I think we're doing far less. And then we can't ignore the health challenge. Ultimately, when you're signaling to the world that a single health crisis can push you back in the way in which it is, that where the world is seeing how broken India's health system is, it doesn't make for a particularly attractive investment destination, even though the stage at which our economy is and the scale actually makes us a market that a lot of countries want to come to, and our capability of ramping up production. So I think that the answer to this question is really for India to look inward on this one and ask itself what is its long-term economic pathway that it wants to choose. And if indeed it recognizes, given the realities of the current context, that an export orientation is important and necessary, then we have to do a lot more to both create a more investor-friendly environment domestically, but also ensure that our overarching policy framework and signaling is appropriate to a commitment to openness.
Thank you for that, Yamini. Tiago, let me pose the next question to you, which has come in from Suruchi Sharma, because this is related to the points that you made earlier. She asks, is the liberal democratic order in a decline post the pandemic? Would you say the pandemic was the pivotal moment for this to have happened, or do you think that process started a long way back? And
Hello, I'm sorry, I just can't hear you. It just broke the connection.
Tiago, checking if you can hear and see me.
Now I can. Should I answer now?
Yeah, go ahead, maybe, Tiago. I think
the
question, right?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I do think that the pandemic accelerated. That's what the most, comparative studies and international reports, for instance, the Variety of Democracies Institute last report includes a section on the impact of the pandemic in the quality and the consolidation of democracy at the global level. And the pandemic accelerated trends that were already on stage before. So in the countries which were somehow backsliding on an autocratic drive, the pandemic accelerated those trends, and in well-consolidated democracies that didn't happen, and they were able, or they have been able to face the pandemic, maintaining civil liberties and the rule of law. Actually, the case of India is one of the. India. It's an interesting case because it's one of the countries which has shown a bigger decline in indicators of democratic consolidation in the last 10 years, especially with this prime minister. I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, that's what all the international reports say. It's issues like the rule of law, respect for minorities, respect for religious pluralism. And actually, I would like to link that to what Constantino, Gulshan, and Yamini have mentioned in their previous interventions. I do think that one of a cause, this is an hypothesis, obviously, but a possible cause for the indefinition that India is facing in situating itself in the multilateral international order, and especially in relation to economic relationship with the outside world, is because of the type of model that it wants to develop. And it seems that India might be evolving, or it could be evolving to some model of economic autarky, as this model has been used in the past and is becoming in other countries, and that is related to the type of ideology that the present prime minister espouses. India has kept its relationships with US and the West because of its rivalry with China, but it has kept those relationships, especially in the military field, especially with US, much less in other arenas, in commerce, in international cooperation, welfare relief, and so on. And it has somehow also established some links, timid still, that's what the observer said. I mean, that's basically what I've read about, with India, with Russia and Iran. So a possible path of future evolution of a possible scenario of India would be, I'm not saying that this is predetermined, but it could be evolving as it faces competition with China to a model of autarky. And this will be accentuated if the present ideology and the present government continues its path. Now, what can the EU and India do to curtail this trend, this possible trend? One thing, I think obviously India and the EU both have an interest in international economic relations which are fair and which respect labor rights. And there's a lot for EU and India to do in these arenas. At the international level, they could work together for a more fair commerce, for fair labor rights, and fair treatment of workers at the international level. And that's something that I do think that India has an interest. And there's also room for military cooperation and welfare relief, cooperation for welfare relief, control of immigrant flows in the Indo-Pacific area and in Africa, also in that continent. I do think that both the EU and India would be able to do that creatively and take advantage of the new opportunities that I do think they're starting to appear with this new international context, especially with the Biden presidency. But I do think that the Biden presidency, it remains to be seen what's how is it going to evolve. But Biden, I do think, makes two big contributions to democracy, to thinking about democracy and to multilateralism. One is to connect internal developments with external guarantees for cooperation and peace and democracy international level. Biden is very clear in showing that a sound and solid and fair and inclusive and egalitarian democracy at home is a condition for a better world and a more prosperous and equitable and inclusive and democratic international system. I do think that both India and Europe should take advantage of this new drive. The second aspect is that Biden sees the world, or it seems to see the world, as divided, and this has risks as well. I mean, and not everybody would agree with this, but that as divided as some form of a competition with two alternative models: authoritarian capitalism in China and democratic capitalism in the West. And the issue is to expand that traditional Western alliance to a global level. And that obviously includes countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Brazil. But the role of India would be fundamental in this. But I do think that's dependent on changing the type of government that India has. And India, with the kind of ethno-populism that it's present at rule in India, I do think that we'll have difficulties in catching up this train, so to speak. Yeah.
I think Mitali is logged off again, and I was given the responsibility to take over to ask questions, but all of you have been asked questions, so I have to ask myself a question. And that's the best thing. But I'll pick one, which is from someone, I think, from calling us from or joining us from Poland, Karina Dzierżowska. She's asking, even though India has been long known for being supportive of multilateralism and global economic governance, it has also preferred to pursue bilateral solutions for political and regional issues. And given that ambivalence, she asks, would you agree that India's multilateralism can be described as pragmatic, especially with regards to the global economic order? I think yes, but I think pragmatism is a response to necessity. And I can think of two examples where India has moved on pragmatically. The International Solar Alliance, for example, that is an intergovernmental institution headquartered in India towards renewable energies with a focus, of course, on solar-powered energies, but also more recently, the Coalition for Disaster-Resilient Infrastructure, a response against climate change in terms of developing norms, standards, through intergovernmental consultations towards disaster-resilient infrastructure that can be a better response to the climate action, so to the climate problem. So I think on these two, you see India advancing, partially tactically, as I called it, but again, using an old political science term, I think there is often an excessive focus on formal institutions and less interest in what we used to call in classic political science international regimes, which really is what matters. I mean, you can have beautiful conventions and formal intergovernmental organizations on paper, but as long as they are not backed up by habits of cooperation and by a normative understanding of what they are willing to or should achieve, cooperation will not translate into action and into real effects. So I'd say only that I see within the West, if I may put it like that, often, not surprisingly, that the US and many European friends are a bit, I'd say, stuck on the formalistic approach of international organizations and trying to reinvent or at least reform what they have built over the last 70 years. And I would say India is a bit more hesitant. It supports that, but it's a bit more pragmatic, to use the question from our participant from Poland. to work and in a more agnostic way. I think that's the word I used initially. In fact, China too. I would caution against people saying that China is reflexively against international institutions. In fact, in many international institutions, China has been more of a play in India, paradoxically. And I think India is realizing that, and therefore also being now a more active voice in trying to reform existing institutions. But more interestingly, that's what I was trying to bring here to the fore, to create new types of institutions, new regimes that are built on the coalition of the like-minded, sector-wise interested, geographic clusters, sometimes bilaterally, obviously not, but trilaterally, quadrilaterally. The Quad that has been in the news, etc. Is the Quad a formal regional organization? Within the Quad, you have countries saying we should have a secretariat, and other countries saying no, let's not formalize it. So you will see these debates playing out, and I think it reflects India's entrepreneurship in terms of building a new multilateralism. And that is, I think, what is most interesting. Just a word on democracy, which I think has been guiding many of our interventions here, and I find really exciting to talk about, because these are the largest democratic polities, the EU and India. If you look at the statement after the Porto summit, I think it was the point 20 or the article 20 of that statement, I think it was the second or the largest of all 40 paragraphs. It was on connectivity. Now, if you look at that, connectivity is, of course, the biggest word that you can invent probably in political science or political action. Connectivity means everything and anything. But the words that were used in that paragraph, and these are carefully crafted paragraphs by negotiators on both sides, came out in a resulting paragraph that is probably the most normative paragraph I've ever seen in recent years in any type of bilateral agreements. It talks about connectivity, but it speaks about sustainable, comprehensive, upholds international law, conforms with international norms, connectivity based on shared values, democracy, freedom, rule of law, respect international commitments, promote connectivity that is transparent, viable, inclusive, sustainable, rules-based. And I could go on for another 6 or 7 words, but I'll spare you that. Just to make the point that the EU and India are now much more comfortable and are creating, I think, the habits of cooperation. These are habits of dialogue, of engagement that did not exist for decades. And they were puzzling that the European Union and India were not really working out and discussing these things. And I think that's the most important, I think, takeaway of the last few months, last year or two, but particularly the last 6 months now. We've seen really these habits of dialogue and conversation happening between Brussels and India. Sometimes they will agree to disagree. But even on human rights, let's get democracy, the EU and India now agree to have a human rights dialogue that had been stagnant for 7 years, I think. So you actually now agree to discuss behind closed doors human rights issues. The European Union has grave concerns about certain issues in India. India has its own approach to human rights and democracy and has concerns about the missionary zeal and pressure and sometimes the outdated European and Western approach to many democracy, understandings of what is democracy. And I think to have the maturity to discuss those things is another indicator of those habits and comforts of dialogue that are evolving between the European Union and India.
Sure. Moderator and panelists both, you're a leading light example of India-EU cooperation. Mr. Sachdeva, let me turn to you for another question. And this sort of sinks in with what Tino was talking about. It's from Dhirendra Yadav, and he asks, could the Quad serve as an effective docking point for the EU to negotiate or to engage, I beg your pardon, in the region? The Quad has only just come to light, and it's being talked about in the last 2 years, I think, with heightened animation. But where do you see that particular dynamic fit into India and EU?
Well, I'll just reiterate the point I was making earlier. All these conversations which are going on in the context of Indo-Pacific, including Quad in this region, the European Union welcomes all of them. At the same time, they are a bit reluctant to be part of the kind of geopolitical competition which is kind of hotting up in this region. So they will continue to be welcoming all these kind of development, because this also to some extent, I think, helps European Union, because yes, it's not that European Union does not understand geopolitics. I mean, geopolitics as a subject originated in Europe, so they know, and they were the colonizer. They knew how the geopolitics can be used, but at the same time, now in the present circumstances, they do not the kind of issues they have in this region, or even within Quads. My understanding is that if you look at countries in Quad, US, Japan, Australia. Now they were anyway for years. I mean, they have been part of same alliance, same kind of security setup. Only thing is that the major qualitative, I think, the change which has happened in Quad is kind of India openly coming and joining, and now in fact pushing these kind of conversations. Now there, European Union would be, kind of, as I said, would be, happy to have these kind of things happening, which would have certain pressure on China. At the same time, not really be actively, in a sense, participating in many of these issues. And this is what I would expect the European Union would be doing in the coming years, and rather, in fact, taking advantage from some of these pressure points which are built over China. Because what has happened, if you look at even the EU-China investment dialogue, now when there was a pressure on China, at that point of time, European Union actually signed the deal, and many things, particularly about state-owned enterprises, particularly about many other issues on labor standards and etc., which China was not agreeing earlier. Suddenly they came out. Of course, I mean, this has been being negotiated for the last 7-8 years. But then European Union also, to some extent, took advantage of the geopolitical competition, or the geopolitical, I would say, pressure which was being built on China. So they would be playing very important game in a sense here. I mean, I would see European Union, yes, they are uncomfortable with China. At the same time, they would be, kind of welcoming all these kind of developments which are happening, which can have pressure on China. At the same time, also engaging with China in a way where they can actually do it. So India has to also be much practical in that sense, because here we have direct security threat, which perhaps Europeans still do not feel that kind of security threat from China. I mean, compared to economic and technology and other kind of things, because for them, in fact, immediate threat perhaps is from Russia, in many areas which is happening. So within the situation, place they are situated, and the kind of transatlantic alliance they have, so they would be from a distance supporting these kind of things, but not actively participating in this. And they would be happy if India start playing much larger role, much more openly, kind of, and close, I think, relationship between India and the United States would also help to some extent. And this has been already helping close the Indo-European relationship, because ultimately, despite even under Trump administration, they had certain differences, but still, I think the transatlantic alliance is quite solid. So India becoming closer to the United States also, to some extent, facilitate, I would say, India-European Union issues going much beyond trade and investment. And we are quite seen that in many other areas, even in security and other issues, India is kind of having serious conversations wherever competencies allow within the European Union, or otherwise talk with the member states. So there is a kind of a convergence happening in certain areas, but European Union, I think, would be slightly a cautious player in all these activities here in the Indo-Pacific.
Yamini, final question to you, and this one comes in from Swati Prabhu about climate action, something we were talking about earlier, saying, is partnership between India and the EU on climate action possible in the Indo-Pacific, considering China? And really, this is the other big one. You have COP26 lined up. There's a lot of negotiation and discussion right now about climate change. What can we do to really use this moment?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, that's the climate conversation is a real opportunity for India and the EU to deepen its partnership and to build both technological technological and research, as well as people-to-people dialogues and exchanges. I think it rests on really how India and the EU are able to come together in ways that address the big question that India is currently confronting, which I don't think we've fully resolved. Are we going to go down the net zero targets and go down the path of ambitiously positioning ourselves along with, which is where the international world really is trying to put, where both the EU and the US are sort of pushing us, or do we want to come up with something that might be less ambitious, but hopefully a lot more doable, and where we can, and in some ways it is for India to make up its mind and then present a convincing argument for support from the EU on this. I myself veer in the direction of realism over ambitious targets that we may not be able to meet. And there's a lot even in that realism that where I think India and the EU can collectively work together on, that will make for a more sustainable, a more viable, and in fact, in the long term, far more ambitious climate agenda than we have at present. So I think COP is a unique opportunity for deepening this dialogue between the two of us, and for India to also be able to leverage support where it needs.
Fantastic. Completely out of time, unfortunately. But to all my panelists, a big, big thank you. This was so deep and so wide. I was wondering how much ground we would cover, but we really did. And a big thank you to the audience as well. I think there's been fantastic participation from all of them. Stay safe, everyone. Till we speak again. Goodbye. Thank you.